in society, we don't usually associate the term sexism against men. We hear the word misogynist, but we don't usually hear the word misandry. And misandry is a dislike of or contempt for ingrained prejudice against men.
I think contempt is the key word there, because discrimination seems vague.
And at times, yes, you discriminate based on sex. Somebody, you want to employ somebody because of the sex of the person. But there is also the ingrained prejudice, and this is what we're going to talk about.
So today's conversation, we're going to be talking about sexism and misandry.
Right. And what's misandry and what's sexism? So misandry could be considered hatred or prejudice against men, typically exhibited by women, but not necessarily. And we are going to see examples where we see that in today's society, particularly in Canada, but it can be extended to other countries. And at times we see it with the language. First of all, and it's very subtle, very polite. In polite society, at times you just do it in a very gentle way, and it's part of this cultural Marxism to undermine some of the foundations or beliefs. And at times we have those foundational beliefs that we as society we have. And how do we express that? At times with language. It's not tangible, you cannot touch it, but those languages and those concepts really undermine some of those foundations. And here's an example. We over the last few decades, we've seen examples with the word chairman, for example. They got rid of the word chairman, and now it has to
Chairman,
be
right? Yeah.
chairman, and now it has to be chairperson. Before they were firemen, but now to be inclusive, even the word inclusivity, it can be weaponized and used to undermine some of the foundations of the language. That's why some people can be anti-semantic, because it goes to the language. And fireman, it was another term that now people don't say fireman, they say fireperson, or the firefighters, right? The firefighters rather. But then how far can you go? Because even in the English language, there are many words. For example, manly. That's very manly. Are you going to get rid of the word manly just to be inclusive? Or man cave? This is my man cave. Are we going to call it the person cave, right? Every man. The manhole, mannequin, man of God, man of cloth, man of letters, all those words.
So with all of these changes to the language and this movement to change words like seaman or, airman, pilot, what do you think? Do you think that this is, I think it goes beyond just discrimination. I think is the heart of the issue here. It's not just about discriminating against men, but it's further than that. It's this contempt towards men just by virtue of being man. So what do you think? So we've defined sexism as in terms of misandry as a prejudice against men, which is the contempt towards men just by virtue of being a man. So where do we see, obviously the language, we see that as a manifestation of this contempt towards men in society, but where else might we see this misandry towards men in society? How is this manifesting itself?
Before I answer that, you talk about contempt, but it's also why. Is the contempt, and is the contempt that would be the result. Bottom line is to undermine those foundations. As a society, you have men and you have women. And the idea is that we collaborate. But it goes back to this cultural Marxism, as it's been framed and called, to undermine the order of society. And you have to have men and women to have an ordered society working with each other. But by undermining a group and pitting one group against another, in the 19th century, we saw that with workers, pitting workers against the employers, Then in the 60s and 70s, it was women, the feminist movement, basically to pit women against men, and at times children against parents. So we see that now with the environmental issues, also to try to pit this organization or this individual against another one. And it's the manifestation of that undermining of the society and the order of society. And how do you do that? At times with language, at times with legislation, at times with policies. Language is one of them, but also with policies that at times do not support women and men working together. For example, in marriages, in matrimony, traditionally in some countries, the legislation was there to support matrimony and the family. Mm. Now there is not much policy. There are not many policies in Canada supporting the family.
What are the consequences of not only just pitting men and women against each other, but even just subsidizing marriage? Now, to me, that seems like it's a bad deal for both men and women, especially married men and women. So how exactly does attacking the family and not supporting families, how does that factor into this, to misandry? Is that actually an attack against men? What are we dealing with here?
Well, you're attacking men, by attacking men and the head of the family, husbands, you're undermining family. If you undermine family and you have children, then the state takes over the role of the children, because the children are not going to have the same care. And right now we see, for example, the role of education. Who is responsible for the education? Is it the parents, the natural providers, and by law also they have to provide the necessities of life and education to the children. But right now we are experiencing in many countries situations where the state, they say, no, we, the state, we are responsible and we have the duty and the obligation to provide that, not the parents. So they're taking away the natural right of the parents to educate, because the parents, what they do is, there is the principle of subsidiarity. If you, the parents, you cannot provide for your family, then the state takes over. And at times it's legitimate. If you are sick and you have a member of your family who cannot physically, they cannot look after themselves, and then you don't have the resources, then the state can take over and then can provide for the care. The same with education. In principle, the parents educate the children, and then you, the parents, there is the principle of subsidiarity. You give the right, your natural right, you delegate that right to the state, saying, okay, we cannot have the resources or the ability to educate, fully educate our children, then the state can provide that education. Right now, we see a lot of politicians saying, no, we, the state, and it goes back even in history, even in the communism, is the state that takes over the education of the children. And then you are not in charge, you, the parents, you are not in charge of what is being taught to the children. And that's another issue. And then when you remove the role of the father, or the husband, or the man in society, you are undermining the cohesiveness of that society. If there is no legislation or resources or guidance or funding to support that role of the family, a lot of men, and we're going to look at the data, end up homeless. If you end up homeless, you are going to end up in a very vulnerable situation. If you end up in a very vulnerable situation, then you are going to be exposed to many risks and dangers to yourself, to your family, by extension, because then if all of a sudden you don't have in the family, there is no husband, no father, everybody suffers. The husband suffers, the wife suffers, financially, psychologically, and then the children. And the facts are there, right? In terms of court cases, psychological studies, research, that everybody suffers. The husband suffers, the wife suffers, and the children, particularly the children, suffer with all the psychological issues afterwards.
This is interesting because we see a lot of, even in our city, we see a lot of homeless people on the street. And most homeless people are men. And it's interesting because you think about how it makes sense if the families fall apart and these people don't have the family support structure to rely on, then the only other thing there for them is the state. And we see how well the state is at looking after people. Clearly, I think the biggest clear advantage to families, and I would know because thankfully I'm in a loving one, is they love you. They are charitable towards you, where the state is incapable of that. They have the bureaucracy, they have all sorts of rules and regulations, and they don't operate the same way as a family does. So it's no wonder that if the state decides that it's their right to look after children and it's not the parents' right fundamentally, then in cases where the state is looking after the children, the chances of them winding up homeless is going to increase because they don't have the support of a family. But then wouldn't you expect that homeless people, it would be more of a balance between men and women? Why are we seeing that pretty much, I think it's over 90% of men, or 90% of homeless people are men?
Yeah, depends on the city. Yeah, more men. At times, women, they have more resources, more the network, fortunately. And also, there are two reasons. At times, the women, they tend to be better at having those connections. And then when it comes to needing some kind of help or shelter, they have that. And also, in our society, the government, which is very good, is great, they provide lots of shelters for women who are either homeless, not so much homeless, but especially women who have suffered domestic violence, as it's called, domestic violence. And there are lots of shelters. For men, there aren't. Which, first of all, as a society, you have to ask yourself, okay, if we are all equal under the law, and then governments, in theory, are supposed to be protecting men and women equally. When you look at, for example, shelters for abused women, there are lots of them, and it's great, necessary, it's vital. But for men, we don't have any. If there is any initiative to do that, to provide shelters for men who have been physically abused, at home particularly, they are just private initiatives. And it's very costly, but the governments, we don't have any funding for that. There are no initiatives. Even when it comes to violence, for example, we don't talk about it. We as a society or in the media, there's no talk about violence or harassment or abuse of men, against men. Practically, it's never discussed. When was the last time there was a debate on the radio, on the media, about violence against men? At home or outside the house, but especially when it comes to domestic violence. I'm not talking about necessarily about violence against husbands, for example, or common law husbands or partners, but also against maybe the father. There are children who are physically abusive against the father, never discussed, or the grandfather. The same also against the grandmother. There is abuse, physical abuse against the mother or the grandmother, and it's never discussed. There is a lot against abuse against children at home, and it's important, it's vital. But when it comes to violence against the father, the grandfather, the husband, never discussed.
Coming back to this issue on even just homeless shelters, perhaps there's numerous reasons as to why there are so many more resources for women as opposed to men. And I mean, on the one hand, women are more vulnerable than men. They're weaker than men. So it would make sense that they have more support than men because they're less capable of looking after themselves. But in addition, perhaps there's less accommodation for men because maybe it's harder to provide shelters for men, given that if men have a higher proclivity to violence, then offering that accommodation might come with more risks. There might be more, I don't know, maybe it's harder to accommodate shelters for men in vulnerable states because men might be violent when they are inebriated or on something.
On drugs, yeah.
Yeah. And maybe that factors in. Like, I'm trying to think of the reasons why, because obviously it's a problem that with the amount of men that are homeless, there needs to be more accommodation for them somehow. But then it's, how do we do that? And more importantly, is this are we not providing that because of this cultural contempt towards men, or is it because of a lack of resources? What do you think based on what we see? Like, do you think that this is a combination of both?
Well, two things you have already generalized. Men can be more aggressive. But when it comes to domestic violence, and again, when I use the term domestic violence, is violence of the spouse, the wife, or the common law spouse against the husband, or against the father, or against the grandfather. And when we are talking about the elderly people, they are not as strong as somebody who is in his 20s. And some husbands, physically, yes, some obviously men, generally speaking, yeah, they are going to be physically more stronger. But those who suffer domestic violence, and they are horrible cases, they are vulnerable people, they are vulnerable men. So yes, we can, on one hand, we can generalize, but those who are suffering the violence, the same as there are women who are very strong, and others physically very strong, and others who are not. When it comes to using violence, it could be a slap, could be a strangulation, could be using a weapon, could be insults, psychologically abuse. And in that respect, when it's psychological abuse, doesn't matter how strong you are. Even at work, men who are being at times abused in the workplace by other men, the fact of the matter is they are the victims, regardless of how strong they are. And again, the proof is that there is misandry in our societies. At times we interiorize this concept of men are stronger, yeah, generally speaking, but when it comes to victims and suffering the harms of, at times, the harms of being at times a man because of society, because of the crimes, because of the domestic abuse, if you are the victim, doesn't matter how strong men are, you are the victim, right? You can be in a very good neighborhood and very safe, but if you are the victim of maybe assault, physical assault, doesn't matter how safe the neighborhood is or at work, you can be employed by a very good employer, but if you are the victim of some kind of abuse, then doesn't matter how good the organization is. The fact of the matter is that you have been the victim of that abuse.
But how often are men victims of abuse?
Well, let's look at the statistics. And I have the Statistics Canada, so very reliable. It's an official agency. And then according to Statistics Canada, that is online, violence and harassment and abuse of men is practically never discussed. And here's the facts. The ratio of domestic assaults in men and women is 1-to-1. So let that sink in. The ratio of domestic assaults in men and women is 1-to-1. What happens is women are 3 times more likely to report domestic abuse, domestic violence to police than men, 3 times. Here's the example. When a man gets maybe slapped or spat on, pushed, that's domestic violence. Some people say, well, you can get over it. I was only pushing you. I was only slapping you. That is, according to the Criminal Code of Canada, that is domestic violence. If it happens to a woman, that is considered domestic violence. But women are 3 times more likely to report it.
So is that factored into the 1-to-1 statistic, do you think?
So there is 1-to-1 because at times men have been the victims, but they don't report it.
So yeah, are they factoring that into the
Yes.
1-to-1? Or would it be that women are reporting 3 times as much, but
I
it's
don't know how
still...
Statistics Canada, they say it's 1-to-1, but
Yeah.
they know that, okay, it's 1-to-1. Again, men tend to be more physically violent because of the strength, generally speaking. But then a woman can be, again, they might use a knife,
Right.
Can be slapping somebody, can be psychological abuse, pushing, and it's still domestic violence.
Mhm. That's still very surprising 1-to-1, because you never hear
never hear it.
Anyone talk. Well, you'd hear about, seldomly you'll hear about a man abusing his wife, but you rarely
But also the
inverse.
fact, here's the fact that women are 3 times more likely to report it to the police. That in itself is already telling you that men, the expectation is, well, just get over it. If your wife pushed you or slapped you or spat at you, just get over it. You are a man. So we have internalized this idea that you are the man. And the shocking thing is, if you mention these facts, this data to women at times, I have done it. When I share this, they are dismissive, generally speaking, not everybody. And I thought that was shocking to me. The fact that women, instead of being sympathetic, instead of trying to, as a conversation, I said, well, this is the data. And rather than being sympathetic or saying, wow, I didn't know that, we should be doing something about it as a society, in terms of policies, maybe the media, we should work on this. They were dismissive. They were even laughing. At times, here's an example, on many occasions, you open the media, the newspapers, you watch it, and then maybe a man, the wife castrated him. And it becomes a joke. There are many jokes about it, but then even in the media over the years, you turn on the TV and then, somebody, in Japan or somewhere, she castrated her husband, and it becomes a joke. So why do we tolerate that as a society? Why is this laughable? We're talking about violence, and somebody has been castrated, a man has been, and then it becomes a joke.
What a double standard, though.
Right.
Imagine the mayhem if it was a man doing that to a woman.
So when it comes to men, according to Statistics Canada, men are 3 times more likely to say domestic violence did not affect them much. Again, because we're men, we say, well, yes, she slapped me, or she hit me, or she pushed me, but it wasn't a big deal, right? Police are 14% less likely to lay charges when the victim of domestic violence is a man. That's something that as a police force, you can do something about it. Because as a man, you say, well, it's up to me to report it to the police or not to report it. But when it comes to the police, they are 14% less likely to lay charges when the victim of the domestic violence is a man. And according to a team of researchers led by Professor Sarah Desmarais from North Carolina State University, they conducted a meta-analysis. So that means they were looking at the different pieces of research of 249 domestic violence studies. So they looked at basically 250 domestic violence studies, and they found that domestic violence initiated by women is overall more prevalent than that started by men. Which, in a way, as a society, we have internalized that. You as the man, you don't usually go to the police, and you don't initiate that reporting. Women tend to do that.
I mean,
nothing wrong with that.
Right.
Nothing wrong with the women reporting the violence, because we're talking about violence. We're not talking about feelings or perception. We're talking about you have been the victim of violence. Of course, you should go to the police and report it, and the police should investigate and protect yourself from that situation. But when it comes to men are not likely to initiate that.
And it's interesting because if the police are 14% less likely to press charges or even take seriously the domestic assault on a man, then that to me seems like it perpetuates this idea of discouraging men from reporting in the first place. If they know that, okay, if I report, I might not be taken seriously because I'm a man. Like, you know, I have to internalize this because even if I go for help, they're going to laugh and I'm not going to get anything. So what's the point? Like, nothing's going to change. And that's a real problem, because what if the man is in a seriously abusive relationship and that woman is unhinged and she might do something worse to him next time?
The question we can ask is, what can we do about it? Well,
and that's even tolerating the bad behavior on the woman's part. Because then what are the repercussions? Now she knows, oh, I can do whatever I want to this guy and nothing bad's going to happen to me.
In the media, so what can we do? We can educate ourselves. We can educate the public. The governments can start campaigns to make the issue more relevant, and at least to see people that this is happening and it's a problem. We're not going to see it. Most likely, we're not going to see a campaign saying, if you are a man, you are the victim of domestic abuse or domestic violence, please report it. Or even inviting the media to talk about it and to maybe make movies about it, so that at least you are more aware of this, because we understand the things we recognize. If you want to hide from it, you're not going to recognize that, first of all, it's a real situation that is happening, and then how to go about it. Maybe you can have a campaign, or you can have resources to, if you're the victim of, we have the police, we can do it, but we need more awareness. Also,
I don't think we can count on Hollywood for that, though.
you can bet on that. And according to Statistics Canada, major assault, and I quote, is more prevalent, in quotation, more prevalent among male victims. So major assault. So there is a legal definition. Major assault, you've been physically attacked, and so major assault is more prevalent among male victims of intimate partner violence than female victims. This is very revealing. So it's 20% versus 11%. So in domestic situation, men are, when they are the victims of domestic violence, they are 20% more likely to be a man compared to 11% women of major assault. So a woman will use maybe the knife or something that is going to be considered major assault, not just pushing or slapping. Perhaps this reflects the greater tendency of intimate partner violence against men involving weapons. So 22% versus 11% of incidents against women. And Statistics Canada, again, shows that in 2008, that was a few years ago, but 2008, the rate of police-reported physical assault against men was 779 per 100,000 population, was slightly greater than that for women, which was 711 per 100,000 population. However, male and female victims reported different types of physical assault. And here's the data. Females were more likely than males to be victims of common assault, not major assault, but common assault. So like pushing, a slap, or common assault, which is the form of assault resulting in the least serious physical injury, right? And the statistics at that time, it was 575 per 100,000 females and 484 per 100,000 males, which is still, there is a difference, but not huge, right? While males were more likely than females to be victims of more serious forms of physical assault. And this is something that you never hear in the media. And we're talking about, at this point, we're talking about domestic violence, right? The rate of assault with a weapon or assault causing bodily harm, which is considered in the law level 2 among men, is 215 per 100,000 population. It was nearly double than for women, nearly double. So in women, 114 per 100,000 population. However, the most significant difference between male and female victims of assault was found in aggravated assault. What can we do about it? Well, we're talking about changing the perception, changing, trying to prevent that. Very difficult. The same as how do you prevent any violence in the first instance?
Right. Before we get there, though, I mean, don't you think that it makes I mean, to me, it makes sense that women are more likely to use a weapon and conduct this major domestic assault, because a man's push and a man's slap and a man's punch is far more deadly against a woman than if a woman were to do that to a man. So doesn't a woman using a weapon kind of level the playing field a bit? Not that obviously not that we're condoning it, but
Right. Well, violence is violence. Whether it's with a punch that can kill, a punch can kill, and does kill people. Violence, we're talking about violence, so it causes harm. So whether it's violence of a man against a woman or a woman against a man, is violence. So again, if we're all equal and in a society, we're talking about making it safe and trying to, as much as we can, remove that violence, any violence, like discrimination. Whether you give it a different name is discrimination, and the same with violence is unacceptable. Whether you use a weapon or you use something else, or you use poison, or you use a punch, or psychological violence also, is still violence. The police reported rate of male victims of aggravated assault, it was 18 per 100,000 population, was more than three times higher than the rate for female victims. So aggravated assault, again, men are 3 times more likely to suffer aggravated assault than females. We don't hear that. When was the last time? And this is according to Statistics Canada. The women, for men, it was 18 per 100,000 population. And victims, female victims, it was 5 per 100,000 population. And that was in the United States at one point, very much the same. Canada could be comparable. And in 2004, the rate of aggravated assault against males was double than females. And physical force was more common in incidents of physical assault against female victims. Right? It was 54% compared to 44. So 54, 44 is that there is a significant difference, but not huge. And we are talking about physical force. So men were more frequently the victims of assault involving a weapon. And we see that when you open the newspapers, you look at the police reporting. Usually when it comes to men, there's the knife, a gun.
Again, drawn against him.
I'm sorry?
Like the knife or the gun would be drawn against the man.
Right.
In that case.
Right. Yeah. And at times it's men against men, but it's still violence, right? And it's, in terms of the statistics, roughly speaking, depends, obviously the year changes, but 16% of incidents against men and 8% against women. So men are double in terms when it comes to violence, and this with a weapon, there will be twice as many men suffering the violence with a weapon than against women.
Now, given these statistics, I myself don't believe in that these numbers are a coincidence, that it is clear that domestic assault is actually seemingly more of a male issue at this time. And I don't think that's an accident. And I also don't think it's an accident that it's not being talked about in that way. So I'm going to make a claim here, and I want you to either defend it or attack it. But I think that the reason that the domestic assault against men is now higher, and it's going to continue to trend higher, is because of the root cause of this issue, which is cultural sexism towards men. We are being taught, and it's being reinforced through the education, through institutions, through corporations, that men are bad, men are evil just for being men. God forbid if they're straight, and white as well. May as well throw that in there. And I think that this is probably the biggest determinant of why men are facing higher rates of assault, because women are being taught, they're being told their whole life now that men are bad, men are evil, men are going to treat you like crap. And I think that subconsciously, that almost makes it permissible for them to take out their anger, to take out their frustration on men, especially those men that they're closest to, because you're never going to assault a stranger on the street if you're normal. If you're unhinged, you'll assault just about anyone. But for generally speaking, if someone's going to be a victim of murder, usually there's a connection, a close connection between the murderer and the victim, usually. And so wouldn't it be the same logic in terms of domestic assault? Wouldn't it be the case that because women are being told that men are bad, men are evil, and their husband is doing something that they don't like, that they're more likely now, because of the cultural narrative towards men, to carry out violence?
Yeah, those things are factors. Men are different in terms of our development, and psychologically generalizing, we are more physical. If I have something against you, if I insult you, you're going to say, well, let's take it out. That's usually not always, but men tend to be more physical. What did you call me? And then we're going to sort it out physically. Not always, obviously. Whereas women, generally speaking, they don't tend to do that. So in itself, yes, men and women, surprise, are different. And when it comes to resolving or creating conflict or resolving conflict, we are different. Especially when it comes to, again, because men even are the victims of violence from not only women, but also from men. Women attacking physically, and especially when it comes to weapons, other women, is not that common as men against men. So that's the reality, because, again, psychologically, in terms of who we are, the development is different. Even the children, boys, for example, when you are a little boy, toddler, women, they tend to be more sociable. There are studies, they analyze that, and then they can see the little girls sharing toys and working, collaborating. The boys, they have to be socialized. They have to be taught how to share that, not to be more physical against other boys or other girls, pushing them. So we have to learn that as boys, generally speaking. And there are studies showing that. Women, for example, if they want to attack another woman or other man, they might use the network to undermine the credibility of that, but they are not going to be physical. Whereas men, at times, they say, "What did you call my wife?" You know, how many times we see that? And then there are the men, and here we're in Winnipeg, there are many examples. You open the newspaper, and at times there are fights in nightclubs, restaurants, at times on the street. At times there is the rage while driving, and usually it's the men who will get out of the car or in the restaurant. They start with, usually there's a verbal confrontation. It's really rare. It happens, but it's rare that you're walking down the street and somebody punches you or uses a knife just for no reason. Usually there is an engagement, a verbal engagement. In restaurants, when there's been a knife in and somebody got killed, or road rage, or in a nightclub, there is usually a verbal confrontation. What did you call me? What did you say? And then escalates. And then men pull out either a knife or something else, or a punch. And that's usually the bouncers in the nightclubs, the bodyguards in the nightclubs. They are usually men. And then when there's been a fight, usually with terrible consequences, and it's usually start with a verbal confrontation. Now we talked about this type of violence, but also we can talk about the sexual assault against men. So according to Statistics Canada, male victims of sexual assault are, and I quote Statistics Canada, more often victimized by family members other than spouses, or ex-spouses, and by friends and acquaintances in comparison to female sexual assault victims. So I'll repeat, because you never hear that. Male victims of sexual assault are, according to Statistics Canada, more often victimized by family members other than spouses and ex-spouses, and by friends and acquaintances in comparison to female sexual assault victims. And marriage, also, the good news, marriage provides more security than common law partnerships.
Oh, that's a big surprise.
And what do we base this on? I base this on Statistics Canada. So according to Statistics Canada, of those killed at home between 2007 and 2011, that was a few years ago, but still, at least we have some data. And I quote, women were 4 times more likely to be killed by their common law partner than by their legally married spouse. 4 times more likely to be killed by your partner than the spouse. So if you are legally married rather than just living on your own, if you live on your own, living with your common law partner rather than your husband, you have been married in church or civilly, the women are 4 times more likely to be killed by the common law partner than by the husband.
Why do you think that is?
We can look at it. Similarly, men in common law unions were 10 times more likely than their married counterparts to be killed by the partners. So if you're married, fortunately, there were few cases of women, husbands killing wives and wives killing husbands. There were only a handful in Canada. But still, statistically, if you are a man, you are 10 times more likely to be killed by your common law. So you are living together, but there is no marriage. But in law, you are still considered a common law union. But if you are married, you are 10 times less likely to be killed by your wife. And with women, 4 times. Answering your question, why is that? Why do you think? Well, first of all, marriage gives you safety or security. It's a commitment. You are not just, if you are living with somebody and you are not married, okay, I'm living with this person, but next month, if I meet somebody else, if she gets tired of me, right?
Yeah,
it's a matter of fact. If she finds somebody or you find somebody else better or more convenient, you are going to leave the relationship because you're not committed to that relationship. Whereas if you are married, legally married in the church or in the civil court, at least there is a commitment. Again, they can dissolve that, but at least psychologically you are more committed.
I think it's even more than that. I mean, you think about, I was recently at a wedding and you think about the ceremony, and there is something deeply psychological about it, that when you are up there and you're going to be signing the paper, you're going to see your future spouse walking down the aisle, your future wife. And there's something that I think, especially as humans we're symbolic and we understand symbolism, that's no longer just my fiance, that's my wife. And in taking the vows, in sickness and in health, you take the good and the bad, and
you're learning those values.
Yeah. And even just being, like you have to actually say those words, those words have to come out of your mouth.
So publicly you are saying,
yes,
I am committed.
And it's that public commitment that you don't get that from being common law. And I think that in and of itself has deep psychological impact, that to me, that is no surprise that a common law would be more likely to get physically violent than married couple, because if you're getting married, there is that level of commitment that just isn't there. And I think that speaks volumes.
It's quite different, but in a way, there's psychological aspect really resonates, because even with a contract, you can be working with somebody with no contract and you can be committed. But once you say, let's write it down here, I'm going to put down my name and I'm going to sign saying I'm going to be committed to this employment, the employer and the employee, there's a public commitment. You can dissolve that contract, but at least you are saying, now I'm more committed. But yeah, with marriage, it's more complex and deeper than that. Now, even I mentioned shelters, and here in Canada, there are no shelters for men of domestic abuse. Here in Winnipeg, there might be something on ad hoc, something that maybe somebody had put together, but in terms of funding, there are no shelters as such. There was one group a few years ago in Toronto, they wanted to start something like that. And that particular advocacy group, they received 400 calls from men who were victims of domestic violence. So in 1 year, they received 400 calls inquiring about it. So that's a lot. And we're talking about victims of domestic abuse.
And 400 is a lot, considering that it's not like this would have been well known.
Right.
It's not like everyone knows about this.
And we are talking about men who they would have reached such a point to reach out to this organization to say, well, do you have something? I need help.
Because that 400 would be a very small percentage of a much larger population of males who are going through that. Yeah.
I mentioned police. So let's look at the police. Because again, it's part of the society. Men are more likely to be formally charged by police when a complaint is made, according to Statistics Canada. So I'm not making this up. So if you're a man, you are more likely to be charged with domestic violence than women.
For the same assault?
For the same assault. So men are 7% more likely to be charged with multiple crimes in an incident. Men's charges are more likely to be pursued in court. And then figures according to Statistics Canada is 28% of cases withdrawn compared to 37% of women.
So that is just a clear-cut case of look at the attitudes of society towards men.
Right. Men are 11% more likely to be found guilty in court for the same type of crime. 11%.
Because it's not, I mean, we got to be real here. It's not worse when a man does it. It's bad in both instances. Both instances should be punished equally under the law.
In theory.
In theory.
But as George Orwell said, some animals are more equal than others.
Oh, yes.
In Animal Farm.
Yes, that's right.
So when they are found guilty, men are 9% more likely to be sentenced to prison than women for the same crime. So men are 9% more likely to be sentenced to prison than women. For most crimes, men are sentenced to significantly longer prison sentences than women. So the question is, why is that? I cannot answer. Well, partly it's because of the misandry that we were talking about it. This discrimination, just because you are a man, you are more likely to be sentenced to prison, and the sentence is going to be longer than if you're a woman.
Right. Well, it's beyond discrimination. And
this is according to Statistics Canada.
Yeah.
Men are men represent 76% in youth correctional services. 76% are men in youth correctional services, and 94% of Canadian federal offenders. So in prison, 94% of prisoners are men.
Yeah, but Jesus, there's a whopping 6% of all prison inmates are women. That has to go.
You're being ironic. We have to say here,
yes,
being facetious. Correctional Service Canada, I was looking at the statistics. So according to Correctional Service Canada, they state that, quote, women offenders were granted federal day parole and federal full parole at a higher rate than men offenders over a 10-year period. And the question is, why? obviously based on sex. If you're a woman, you're most likely to have a day parole and also full parole than if you're a man.
Could that also be because women are less threatening than men?
We don't know. I don't know the answer to that question because the Correctional Services Canada, they don't usually. Yeah, but again, is it based on sex or based on the individual?
Right.
Because if
right
when you are so and so is most likely to reoffend based on his history or her history. Okay, I can understand that. But when, generally speaking, when you are saying this in terms of statistics is different. According to Statistics Canada, males are much more likely than women to be the victim of violence perpetrated by friends, acquaintances, strangers, or a business partner. And in 2012, in Canada, 7 out of 10 homicide victims were men. 7 out of 10 homicide victims were men.
Wow.
So, and that's the reality. You even every day you open the media and then usually at times to do with drugs, at times to do with the 7 deadly sins. They are called deadly because they can be deadly. At times it could be greed. It could be at times envy. It could be concupiscence, lust, and at times pride. But when it comes to nowadays, because of drugs, alcohol, at times people escalate. As I said, there are people who immediately, what did you say? What did you call me? And then they escalate. Studies point out that men get the short end of the stick in divorces. So let's talk about divorces and parent rights. So I'm sorry, but if you're a man, when it comes to divorce and parent rights,
bad news.
Yeah. So let's look at the statistics. Men are 2 times more likely than women to lose social support after separation or divorce. If you're a woman, men. If you are a man, you are more like twice as more likely than women to lose that social support. Men are 2 times more likely than women to experience depression after divorce. This is interesting. You don't hear about this anywhere. And men are 6% more likely to be underrepresented in divorce proceedings. Underrepresented. And in Canada, 96% of child support orders are against men or women. Against men.
Is an obvious one.
Right. According to Statistics Canada, 96%. That is fascinating, to say the least. I mean, to put it mildly, because you think, why is it that 96% of the chances of the cases, men are going to lose the custody of the children?
And I mean, if you think about it, those 4% of women who are paying child support must have screwed up royally to be part of the 4%.
Right.
Like that, think of how, because divorces can get ugly. So that 4% must be a very lovely bunch of women.
And the Department of Justice points out that 77% of sole custody orders are made to mothers. 77 of custody orders, right? 77. And it is concerning to learn that 1 in 5 Canadian children, or about 2 million in total, live without the father. Why is this? This is very concerning. Why? Because research shows that children without the presence of a father fare worse in life.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that they are not going to succeed, but they tend to fare worse. And I'm not making this up. There are lots of studies supporting that. Are they going to do well in life? Yes, they do. Yeah. Lots of them do. Lots of them don't. But we know from psychological studies and societal studies that the children with both the mother and the father tend to do better. Statistics Canada states that, and I quote, education indicates, this is also very interesting when it comes to education. So we talked about divorce, but let's look at the boys when it comes to education. According to Statistics Canada, and I quote, education indicators show that women generally do better than men. This, and I quote, "This gap in favor of women is even noticeable at a young age, since girls often get better marks than boys in elementary and secondary school." End of quote. And in 2010, 10.3% of young men compared to 6.6% of young women dropped out of high school. So if you are a boy, you're more likely, almost twice as much to drop out than if you are a female student. And higher education. Let's look at higher education. Since the early 1990s, the majority of students in higher education in Canada have been women. 65% in 2013-2014. And 59% of part-time students have been female, according to Statistics Canada. So now there are more women. So in terms of opportunities, if you have a degree, you have more, generally speaking, you have more opportunities. And in theory, young men should be having the same access or being encouraged to study in higher education at university or colleges as women.
I think more so.
Right. And usually there are campaigns to promote women to study in universities, but there are no campaigns to promote. And yet, when we have a good, highly educated workforce, it's better for the society, for the individual, for the family, and for society.
Right.
And it should be regardless whether you're a man or a woman, because the minute you start discriminating, just because you're a man, we're not going to, with the government, we're not going to spend as much money to encourage you, or in terms of maybe grants. There are lots of grants even for businesses. If you're a woman, there are lots of grants for women. But if you're a man, there are not many resources there just because you are a man. I mean, there are grants for businesses, but specifically if you're a woman, there are women's associations for business associations supporting women. But for men, there are no.
I would actually even argue that there absolutely needs to be more support for men than women. And I think this is actually something that governments should discriminate in favor of men, because if you think about it, women are supposed to be mothers. They're supposed to be the caretakers of the family. And what kind of values are you reinforcing when you are incentivizing women in the workplace over men, which is what we're seeing now? You're effectively telling them that it's better to be a breadwinner. It's better to go out and pursue a career than it is to start a family. Because where is the support for women who want to be a stay-at-home mother? Where's the support for women who want to start a family and do the right thing and stay home and raise their kids? Contra-wise, why is there no incentives for men to pursue a good career, so that the family only needs one salary to live and one income? Because the families, ultimately, you have to think about this as on the macro level, because if you have a state where families, the woman is out working and the man is also out working and they're making less money, and there's more opportunities for the woman, so the woman has to work harder, but then the woman is also responsible for raising the kids, and the woman is responsible for taking care of the house and doing the cleaning and doing the cooking. How is that fair to the woman who's expected to do all that? And then where is the expectations for the man? I mean, you look around, and the biggest thing, I can attest to this as a young man, the biggest thing men crave right now is responsibility, because they're not getting it. They're not told to take a load, to be productive. They're told, oh, you play video games, that's fine. Oh, you want to waste your time? Fine. Whatever. And then they're catering all the opportunities to the women. I think that's a travesty, because now not only are you discriminating against men in that regard and taking away what men are supposed to do, you are keeping women out of the home. You're keeping women from starting a family. It doesn't make sense to me. And then if a woman becomes a mother, she's going to have to take time off work anyway, because I'm sorry, if you're pregnant and you're going into labor, you got a child to raise, and that messes with hormones. Then the woman may be less inclined to go back to work after. And she might just stop working altogether. And so then where are these incentives going? You're investing this money into someone who is not going to be as productive as a man. Plain and simple.
You made very good points there. And one thing is what we individually we do, and we as a society or governments can help with this. And you have brought up a very important topic, is how does a government can support those women who are wives and mothers. Typically in many countries, the governments, they used to support women, the family. They used to say, okay, if you have one child, two children, 3 or 4 children, then in terms of paying taxes, you are not going to pay taxes, or you're going to pay a minimum tax. Or if you have 4 children, then it's considered a large family. So we're going to give you incentives when it comes to maybe, for example, going to school. It could be free, or university will be free if the university is not free. In some countries it's free, in some countries it's not free. Even transportation, or if you have 4 children, you just pay a minimum compared to what other person will pay for the ticket. Like, for example, let's say, flying. If you have a family of 4, instead of paying X amount of money, the government is going to subsidize that to encourage precisely the point that you're making. Individually, we see there are two things that comes to mind. During the COVID years, when there were so many restrictions and there was so much stress on so many families, individuals, and workers, I remember reading an article in the local newspaper when lots of women, they were leaving the workforce during the COVID years because the stress, it was so much that they realized that what they wanted was to work with the family. So they said, yes, I'm working in this establishment, I'm working but my family, looking after myself, my husband, and my children is more important than this salary. And there were more women leaving the workforce during the COVID years than men. And it tells you, because at one point, and especially even there are statistics when in some professions, for example, lawyers, women are, after a certain age, they tend to leave the profession compared to the male partners, the male counterparts. Yeah. So why is that? Well, because men and women are different. And then at one point, a lot of women, they realize my family, my children is a priority. And also we see, this is anecdotal evidence, there are more women, and you see that even online, more women who are more interested in starting their own families. They are young women. They say, I've been sold a lie with this radical feminism. My career is to devote myself to my family, my husband and my children, and I want to be a housewife. And there was a journalist from the local newspaper a few months ago. She was a radical feminist, second class radical feminist. And she wrote an article. I read her articles, and to my surprise, she discovered all these young women who wanted to be, I want to be a housewife. This is my choice, because here in Canada, you have the choice. Nobody's forcing you. And then to her surprise, she realized that there were a lot of young women, and obviously she was looking for that information, because for many years now, she must be in her 30s, and she realized, well, at one point, I won't be able to have children. Right now, I don't have any children. And then she was looking online, and she was coming across so many young women saying, I want to devote my life to my family. I don't want to work for another man. My man is my husband, and I want to look after my children. And then they start making the case, who better than myself to look after my children rather than paying a stranger to take care of my children?
And you have to think about it pragmatically too. I mean, if you're a woman, I've never met a woman who just decided to settle on the man she decided to be with. So if you are that picky and discerning when it comes to picking your husband, isn't that the kind of man you'd prefer to work for and prefer to serve and obey and submit yourself to than your boss at work, who you don't get to choose, and he determines your wages, and he certainly doesn't love you the way your husband does or should? Another point is that in talking about marriage and the marital role, it is a right. It's a natural right for women to stay home and raise the family. It's not just, it'd be nice if my wife could stay home and take care of the family. No, she actually has the right to that through marriage. It's part of the covenant of marriage. It's in the Bible. It's in the New Testament. And I mean, it's so naturally ingrained. I rarely, maybe once, have I met a woman who said that I'd rather work than raise kids, or that I don't want kids at all. It's very rare. And even women that I have met who said, well, I don't want kids. Well, if you pursue the career path and then you reach age 30 and then age 40 comes along, and then you realize I've already done it all. Where am I going to be at 45? I'm going to be alone on Thanksgiving. I'm going to be alone on Christmas. No one cares about me. No one loves me. No one's going to take care of me. I'm getting old. And that, I think, around the age 40, 45 is when it starts to click for women. And that's when they realize they've been duped, because
even before, because they realize that they only have, in terms of being able to have children,
yes,
is limited.
Yes.
And they know. And some of the women, they tell you, it's like, I'm already in my mid-20s or 30 and my time is limited. And that's a fact of life. When you look at the obituaries, and you read the obituaries of people when they die, nobody says, he wished or she wished he had spent more time at work. And it's always, when you read the obituaries, it's to do with the family, the connections, the friends, how they spend the time and those relationships. And they always mention the children. Nobody mentions the people at work. It's interesting. You look at the obituaries and they always mention, okay, she worked for such and such company for so many years. But when it comes to the nitty-gritty, what it really matters is always the family, the relationships, the parents, the children, the grandchildren, the nephews. It's because we are humans. We are not machines. And then we're being sold this idea that there was a woman, an Italian lady, who said a long time ago, I used to be the queen of my home. And you, she was referring to you, the feminist, you have demoted me. And now I'm just a worker. Yeah. So from being the queen of my own castle, and now you, from being in charge, she was also talking about metaphorically, but she made a very good point. As a society, you have a role, and more young people, yourself included, are discovering that the traditional values are important because they work for you as an individual, for you as a unit, as a family, and for you as a society. And more people are saying, oh, I have discovered tradition or the traditional roles because, again, we are in a free society, fortunately, and you say, it works for me. So I want to be a housewife. I want to be a good husband, or I want to be a good wife, or a good son, or a good daughter. And I want to stick to the values that traditionally, and more people are saying, what we hear at times, the media, Hollywood, or cultural Marxism, it doesn't cut it. Because when you analyze it, you think, who's benefiting? And that's why at times when you say, well, there's a divorce, or there is you move out of the house, and you end up, you as a wife or as a husband, or the children, they end up in situations that are going to be more dangerous, more deleterious, more harmful for you as an individual, as a family, and as a society, because then there are also costs. If you end up homeless or with an addiction, or if somebody kills you, or somebody stabs you, or you have mental issues, there is a cost, direct cost and indirect cost to everybody, your family, yourself for starters, your family, your friends, and society. Yeah. When it comes to life, who lives longer, men or women?
I think women slightly, yeah.
So a man in Canada can expect to live 79.4 years, 79, which is pretty good because compared to 200 years ago or 500 years ago. A woman, 83.6, according to Statistics Canada. And according to Statistics Canada, and I quote, at every stage of the life cycle, males are more likely than females to die. So
that's not surprising.
So a boy is more likely to die than a girl. A teenager, a male teenager is more likely to die than a female teenager, and an adult than at every stage of the life cycle. Let's talk about deaths at work. Do you think that there are more men dying at work than women, or more women than
it's
men?
absolutely men, because men take the dangerous jobs. They're the fishermen, the bricklayers, the firefighters, they're the police. Yeah. 97%
of deaths at work are men.
Yep.
97.
Mm-hmm.
We are talking about Canada. And in Canada, a woman can work in any job.
That's
But
right.
they choose, I mean, it's their prerogative, they choose not to have the most dangerous jobs. Men take more dangerous jobs, as you said, and suicide rates are much more higher among men than women in every single country. I looked at the statistics published by the United Nations. In every single country, without exception, men commit suicide more than women. So 7% of men diagnosed with depression kill themselves. 7% of men, and women 1%. So if you are a man, you have been diagnosed with depression. Well, 7% of men diagnosed with depression, you are going to commit suicide. Whereas women, only 1%. Why is that? Maybe they have more resources. I looked at the statistics. I didn't look at the reason behind that. At times in these studies, they only look at the statistics. They don't go into the why is that, why as a society this happens. Also, men are 6% less likely to ask for professional help when they experience depression.
Mm-hmm.
Because men, we don't talk about emotions and feelings. And only half as many men seek professional help for mental health problems compared to women. Only half. Mm. And also when it comes to cardiac problems, even when it comes to health issues. So men suffer cardiac problems 7 to 9 years earlier than women.
Mm. Could that be partly biology too?
Well, and habits, because men are more likely to smoke and to take higher risks than women.
So we could chalk that up to something biological, behavioral.
Yeah, and at times society, we are expected. So men are 10% more likely than women to have a new diagnosis of cancer. 10%, which is also relevant because we hear about cancer for women cancer. There are clinics, specifically programs targeting women to diagnose, to prevent. But for men, not as much. There are clinics for women specifically, but there are no clinics for men specifically.
Right.
When it comes to government supporting and financing these issues. Men are less likely to adopt healthy habits, and men are less likely to seek medical appointments than women. And 4 out of 5 deaths due to fentanyl are men. So when we talk about drugs, overdoses, fentanyl, very dangerous drug. 4 out of 5 victims, overdoses are men, which is also, it tells you a lot. And when it comes to homelessness, you mentioned it, there are more men than women. 65% in Winnipeg are men. That was a few years ago, in 2018. And men work an average of 4 hours per week more than at their full-time jobs than women.
Well, that's not fair. That means they're being paid more too.
So and on average, men spend 4 hours a week more than women traveling to the full-time jobs. That's also interesting. That means they are going to spend 4 hours more away from home, or even if you live on your own. Men of working age are 3% less likely than working men to have a university degree. And for younger workers, the difference is 8%. So as a young person, 8% greater chance of not having, if you're a man, not having a university degree than a woman.
And that indicates that number is growing, that difference. Because if they're doing,
And in certain fields,
yes.
then you can. And men's real wages, let's talk about real wages. Men's real wages increased by 18% between 1988 and 2008. 18%, 1/8. In the same period, women's wages increased 11.6%, according to Statistics Canada. So the unemployment rate has been higher for men every year since 1989. So when it comes to employment, the unemployment rate has been higher for men every year since 1989. And also men are less likely to keep their job in a recession. And in 2009, the employment rate fell 3% for men and 1% for women. So in terms of increased wages, it was, I made a mistake. The men's real wages increased by 1.8% between 1988.
That sounds better, yeah.
And for women, it was 11.6%, according to Statistics Canada.
So men's real wages rose
only less than 2%.
So 1.8% from 1988
and 2008
till 2008, and for women it rose
11.6%. So according to Statistics Canada, this is interesting because we never hear that. So you can imagine my surprise when I came across this. Again, it's on the website of Statistics Canada, and I said to myself, "You don't read about this. The media doesn't talk about it. The universities don't talk about it. The feminists don't talk about it. The political parties, even the real wages, right?"
Well, they do talk about it, but they say it's not enough. It's never enough.
And just to finish with this discussion, evidence suggests today's disadvantages and the burdens and obligations and discrimination as per the law, right? As per the Manitoba Human Rights Code, or in Canada. Also the bias, the misandry, and the hostility towards men is, I would say, cultural, is systemic, and it's also structural. When we look at how, at times, the police, the court system deals with men compared to women. So that's why we can say it's structural, how the governments support women's initiatives and programs compared to men's initiatives and based on sex. So, and it's also, I would say, that it's ingrained in our psyche and our society when we have adopted certain attitudes because we're men or women. They say, "Oh, you are a man." And as the anecdotal evidence, when I shared this with female friends and then, or even professional, I was thinking of a psychologist, a woman who was a psychologist and a retired lawyer and judge. They were laughing. Both women, they were sort of, well, so what? So that's why I would say that it's ingrained in our psyche and also it's ingrained in our society. And there's inequality in many areas, as I demonstrated, and men lose out, right? And its consequences, why do we care about it? Because the consequences are detrimental. They are dangerous. Literally, they are dangerous. They are harmful and at times even fatal. And a new mentality. So what's the solution? We need a new mentality, a new culture, and we need measures, at times from individuals, corporations, employment, or the governments. We need programs, we need initiatives, we need funding. We talk about, at times, money for value, and investing in men, it will provide money for value, but also we need money for those values, right? We have value for money, but we need that money for values. And we need funding and we need laws to reverse it, to reverse all of this and to change it for better. And we need this urgently. It's urgently needed because men are suffering and men are dying. So when men lose out, families and societies lose out.
I would say that what really needs to change is the attitudes and beliefs people have fundamentally. I think that if the more people buy into the cultural Marxist views and the feminist views, the worse these divisions are going to get. Because what is the whole point? What is the whole premise of these ideologies? Well, they're to divide. So if you want to get rid of the useless division that is cultivated by these Marxists and feminists, then you have to reject those dogmas. And I think that in order to restore the good and natural order of men and women entering into good, loving, healthy relationships, there needs to be God at the fore of it. God needs to be involved, and there needs to be faith, there needs to be tradition and an appreciation for these values, because they're based on human nature. You know, God created us. He created us in his image. He created us in his likeness. He knows us better than we know ourselves. So if we have...
Yeah, and God gave us families, and it works.
And if we have the divine laws and the natural laws that are instituted by God, and God knows what's best for us, why wouldn't we want to follow them? Why would we believe in our own narcissism and our own ignorance that we know better than the supreme intelligence which created us? It makes no sense to me. And to reject the fact that we are spiritual beings in our core, it's part of who we are as human beings. We've always been spiritual. There's nothing natural about being an atheist. You might subscribe to the wrong faith, but there's always that inclination to see what is beyond, to aim higher. And that is, in a way, our calling to God. It's our way of connecting to a higher being that transcends our own ignorance. And if we only took the time to look around us and see that things are the way they are because God created them that way, and surely he created us in his own way, then we should enter into marriage knowing that we have duties and roles to play that are instituted by God.
Well, and in the marriage is you're working with each other. You as a husband, you support your wife. The wife supports the husband, and the unit, in the marriage and the family, and you are both working towards the same goal. You are committed. And in every relationship, even with friends or at work, nothing is perfect. But then when you have that foundation, those principles, because you know where you're going, you know who you are, you know why you are doing what you are doing. In this case, okay, why am I married and why do I have this family? Then it helps you to be grounded, and especially, your religion, your principles, your values. Is it going to be perfect? No. Life is not perfect. Are there crises every single day? There is anxiety, health issues, financial issues, problems. But because you're working together, it's better to... Angels can fly because they take themselves lightly, but also they have two wings. So you have to keep things in perspective, and it's like having two lungs. Yeah, there are some people who they can function with one lung, but there is a reason why we have two lungs, and there is a reason why we have the husband and the wife. And the children, they need the mother and the father, and then the husband needs the wife, and the wife needs the husband. It's not rocket science. Every single study supports that. Well, not every, depends on who has done the research.
But we don't need studies to know common sense.
Right, and that's the common sense. And when you look at families, there are millions. The good news is the things we talked about today, to some extent, is a minority, all things considered. There are millions and millions of families in Canada, all around the world, who are very successful. They're not going to make the headlines, but you look around them, and at times you say, okay, why is this family successful? And again, we can define success. What is successful? I'm not talking about financial success. We're talking about how do they succeed in life, right, to do well as a family, as a unit, or as a husband or as a wife. And at times we can be inspired by them and then look for good practices, the same as organizations, they look for best practices. And when it comes to marriages, we look around since we were children and thinking, okay, why is this family doing so well as a family? And we can learn from that. Also, Church, Holy Mother Church teaches us these are basically it's almost the recipe to have a good life, to lead a good life. Is it perfect? No, you are going to encounter problems, but we're going to tell you when you encounter, like in an organization, health and safety, we're going to encounter problems with health and safety. But when we encounter that, this is how you prevent it, or we can do the best to prevent it. And then when we encounter these problems, this is how we can try to deal with them. At times you can solve them, at times you cannot solve it, but at least you have a plan. And I usually say that this is what the church has provided us, and our tradition is our GPS.
Yes.
And it's our God's plan for salvation, GPS, or the sat nav, as they call it in the UK. And when you deviate, you can end up in the ditch. You can end up off the road, deviate, you go off track, and you can end in trouble. At least if you follow the GPS, it gives you some guidance. You still have to drive.
Yes.
Nobody can drive for you.
That's our free will.
It's the free will, and you have to have the machine, the vehicle, a very expensive piece of metal, and then those values, the virtues, society, the tradition, the church can provide you with that vehicle to lead you, but you still have to do the driving, and you have to take the car every now and then to the body shop to keep an eye on and change the wheels to make sure that everything and tidy. So in life is very much the same. We have to do those things, and those who know, they do it, and that's why they succeed as marriages, couples, and families. Not everybody succeeds, but not everybody has the tools. You have to have the ability to do it, the motivation and the opportunity.
And you have to have the virtue. Can't forget that, because I think if people did focus more on developing their character through developing virtue, there would be less sexism. There would be less of this misandry to begin with, because attitudes wouldn't be coming from a place of contempt towards one another. We would be looking at each other from a charitable point of view instead, because that's what the church teaches. And you
respect the other person, the dignity. You look at the dignity, the dignity, your own dignity, and then the dignity of the other person. And especially when it comes to spouses, that's why you choose your spouse. She chose you because of that, the love, but also you're going to respect her, and you're going to treat her with the dignity, the most out respect, and the dignity and love. Yes. And care in good times and in bad times.
Yes.
Okay, you are not going to be perfect. Nobody's perfect, but at least you know who you are, and you know that she's your spouse. Yeah.
Yeah. So solution would be
the solution. Well,
virtue.
This is part of the solution. The virtue. This is being aware of this and trying to do better, be better, do better as an individual, with your spouse, with your family, you as a son, or as a brother, or as a husband. The same for the women, as a daughter, or as a wife, or as a mother, or as a neighbor, or as a friend, or as a colleague, trying to be a good person and try to do better, helping, respecting the other person. But then there are practical things, even at home, you can do it, but even at work. And that's something that you don't need the government to do that.
Yeah.
The governments do help, because you have to have also the infrastructure. Yes. You have to have institutions, hospitals.
Yeah, they have a role to play.
They do. And at times, if you are in dire straits, you need some support. If you don't have any family or support yet, you need that. But as an individuals, but again, God uses us. We are the instruments, but without instruments, there is no music.
Yes. And I would say that if contempt is the root of sexism and misandry, then the antidote would be charity, love.
And charity comes from Latin caritas, it's the love. It's the love that you give to somebody. In other languages, you have two different words for that. Because in English, the English language, there is only one word for love. You say, I love God, I love my country, I love my wife, and I love coffee. It's the same, I love you guys. And it's the same word. Whereas in other languages, there are 3 or 4 different words to express the different level and the commitment. But charity is something that you do to the other person without expecting anything in return.
Yes.
And not because out of justice. If you phone the electrician, you have to, out of justice, you have to compensate his knowledge, his work, his time. But out of charity, you are helping somebody. It could be a friend, could be somebody who is homeless.
Yes.
You are giving your time or money, not because you have to, because you don't have the moral duty to do it.
Mm.
You're not obliged to do it, but you are doing it out of charity, out of love for that, for the other person or for the common good.
Yeah. Out of mercy.
Out of mercy.
Because like God will exercise justice on us, but he also exercises mercy while we're living.
Right. If the other person is going through different, out of mercy, you want to help. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's good to be merciful to one another, just how God is merciful towards us.
Right.
Because each of us are fallen and fall very short of God. So
great conversation.
Yes.
Well, a good company and good conversation are the sinews of virtue. So
we're on our way. Okay.